The greatest maritime disaster in the history of America took place on a calm July morning in 1915 in the city of Chicago, about 4 blocks from the Wrigley Building. That's right downtown on the Chicago River, in about 20 feet of water and less than 20 feet from the dock. On that July morning, the SS, a cruise ship with about 2,500 people on board, capsized, or turtled in the maritime vernacular of the day. This turtling trapped about 1,000 people below deck, 812 of whom would die. How did it happen? Who's responsible? Well, that's the story we're going to tell you today. Hi, I'm the 100 Proof News Hound, and we're here with another episode of the 100 Years and More Show. Make sure to like and subscribe. It's important for the development of the channel. Now, it really was the greatest maritime disaster involving Americans. The Titanic and the Lusitania get all the press, but there were only about 200 Americans on each of those ships. All 812 people who died on the SS Eastland were either American citizens or aspired to be. So why haven't you heard about the Eastland disaster? Well, the real reason is that there were no Vanderbilts or Astors on board the ship. Newspapers love celebrity, and this disaster, the Eastland, involved the working class families of mostly Central and Eastern Europeans. It just wasn't newsworthy outside of Chicago. Now, the memory of this lingers on in Chicago, but really not anywhere else. In telling the tale of this story, let's begin at the beginning. And that's with the ship itself, the Eastland. It was laid down in 1902 and delivered to the company in 1903. The ship was about 265 feet long and it displaced 2,000 tons. It was about the size of a World War I destroyer. And like a destroyer, it was really quick. It was fast. It was designed to go 20 miles an hour, which is really quick on the water for a ship of that size. It's really about as fast as a pre-dreadnought battleship or armored cruiser. And with respect to civilian ships, that is a quick ship. One of the problems that had, and that eventually led to its downfall, is that in order to make it fast, they made it sit high in the water. It didn't draw a lot, about 19 feet. It could cut through the water, but it was deficient in stability, and that's going to play out as we tell the story here. I'll tell you, the Eastland had a really interesting career before its ultimate tragedy here. It was actually involved in the first year of operation in a mutiny. When was the last time you heard about a mutiny? But this wasn't just any mutiny. This was the mutiny of all mutinies. Better than the Strawberry Incident in the Cane Mutiny. Here we have the Detroit Free Press, August 14th, 1903. Mashed potatoes cause mutiny. Locked up in baggage room under guard. Case will be pushed and men may have to serve time. They mutinied because they didn't get mashed potatoes. The steamship Eastland came in nearly an hour late today. The cause being a mutiny on board. The accused are the firemen who refused to work because it is claimed the mashed potatoes were not served to them as promised. They think they got boiled potatoes, but they weren't mashed. They wanted mashed. It says that the perpetrators were put in the baggage room under lock and key, and they were guarded by a Chicago policeman who just happened to be on board at the time. Now, the Benton Harbor Evening News of August 14th, 1903 adds a little to the story. It says, Eastland stokers put in irons, refused to feed boilers because potatoes were not mashed. They were marched to the police station, held for a while, until the captain could vent. The captain went there and went nuts. And then the chief of police ultimately said, this is crazy, and let the guys go. And as a matter of fact, the shipping company fired the captain the next day. But it was a mutiny, and it was over mashed potatoes. And March 14th, 1904, in the Port Huron Times, there's an announcement with respect to, what kind of business the Eastland's going to be doing. It says it's going to be working the run from South Haven, Michigan to Chicago, and that it leaves every morning, the return trip leaves every morning from Chicago at 9:30. And it notes that alterations are being made to the machinery of the vessel, which will materially increase the speed of the boat. That includes moving the boilers around and some other sleights of hand, which had the effect of making it go a little quicker, but again, decreasing stability by raising the center of point of balance. All about speed here. January 27th, 1904, in the Herald Press, test of speed Sunday. Steamer Eastland beats city of South Haven on Lake Road, hits 20 miles per hour. Everything's about speed. I don't really know why everything's about speed, because we're talking about pleasure craft here that are making basically milk runs for scenic purposes, but they want to be known as the fastest ship on the lake, and the Eastland gets the moniker the Greyhound of the Lakes. It is a quick ship. Here we have there's some problems with stability that begin appearing as early as 1904. Here we have the July 19th, 1904 Chicago Tribune. It says, alarm on steamer Eastland explained by inspector. And this is a two cute kind of stories here. The first one is you can tell it's all information provided by the company, and the second one is going to be all information provided by one of the passengers. So let's look at how they describe the two scenes here. It says, alarm on steamer Eastland explained by inspector. Listing of boat which frightened the crowd is due to empty ballast tanks. Huh? Yeah, empty ballast tanks. The ballast tanks had been empty to raise the boat so we could get over a sandbar, but they didn't refill them after they got over the sandbar, and the boat began rocking like crazy. It says here the listing was caused by empty tanks so they would float higher in the water, as we just said here. And the company tried to portray this as a non-incident. It says here, what they said was some young fellows thought it would be fun to put on life preservers and pretend they were frightened. This started a cry for preservers, and a great many put them on. The women apparently panicked and put on life preservers. That's how the company spins it. But let's see what happens. Let's see what a passenger had to say. In the Lancaster Daily Intelligencer, July 18th, 1904, headline is turned hose on passengers. They hosed down the passengers? What is this, a riot in the deep south here? It says panic threatened a disaster to the steamer Eastland. It said here it was a sunny day and everybody wanted to sit in the shade. So everyone moved over on the deck over to the shady part of the boat, causing the boat to tilt. Well, the boat began listing, and it listed so much that the crew had to go below and shut the portholes on that side of the boat because water was actually pouring into the ship. Some women saw this, started screaming, put on the life preservers, and the crew was at once mustered by the officers to basically put down the rebellion here. The passengers refused to obey the orders to move to the other side of the ship, and finally, in order to drive them away from the rail, the fire hose was used. It proved effective. Of course it did. And the crowd was forced below decks. Reminds me of Inspector Drummond standing in front of that burning house, waving his arm, saying, nothing to see here. But look at the contrast between how the company spun it and what really happened from the passengers. As a result of that incident, the Chicago Tribune ran an article on August 5th saying the passenger permits are cut down on the Eastland, and it must carry fewer passengers, and they reduced the limit from 3,000 to 2,800, which still would prove to be too many. Article in the Cleveland Plain Dealer, June 7th, 1907, it says the ship was built for speed. There's a nice photo of the Eastland, and they describe what kind of run the Eastland's going to be making that year. It says here, it'll open the excursion season today. You got to realize Great Lake excursions, it's something that hardly exists anymore, but back 100 years ago, it was all the rage. Nobody had a private boat. There's hundreds of thousands of boats on the Great Lakes right now. But then if you wanted to go on a boat, you went on an excursion boat. And every city had a destination. Cleveland would drive you the 40 miles down the lake to Cedar Point to the amusement park and picnic grounds. In Detroit, you would go the 10 miles up the river to Boblo Island, which was an amusement park picnic grounds. And in Chicago, this trip that we're going to be talking about here was from Chicago to Michigan City, Indiana, about 38 miles away. That was what you did on a Sunday afternoon on the Great Lakes 110, 20 years ago. It says here, the Eastland gets warm welcome is one of the most complete and fastest boats on the lake. Speed, not safety. They're still pitching the speed here. But the Eastland would have some additional troubles. The Cleveland Leader, July 1st, 1912. The Eastland struck severe weather yesterday, and the passengers were thrown into a panic by the storm. Their terror was added to by the breaking of glass in China in the restaurant. Passengers were convinced that it was going down. It began rolling. Again, demonstrating instability, began rolling more than what the passengers would have normally experienced on a similar cruise ship. Then, the same month, 3 weeks later, the Cleveland Leader reports on July 26, 1912, that the East Lake hit the breakwater, lost control while it was trying to exit the harbor, ran aground on the breakwater. The seas as they could be, if you can call Lake Erie seas. The seas were too rough for the Eastland. Couldn't unload passengers onto another ship there. They had to go back to the docks, wait for the weather to subside a little, and then they were able to disembark the people. But again, the ship was not as stable as it should be. And here's an ironic ad in the South Bend Tribune, May 29th, 1915, in light of what was going to happen a month later. It says here, don't fail to make the trip from St. Joseph to Chicago. The big all-steel SS Eastland is the boat for you to ride on. They list their attributes. It says, safety, speed, and comfort. Complies with all government requirements. Safest, fastest, largest of all steel vessels. Twin screw, excursion, steamship on visiting Chicago's ports. So it's the biggest, best, fastest, safest ship. That's what they say. It says here, plan now on taking one or several pleasure trips on this big, safe, floating palace. It is until it isn't. Well, that wonderful offer of the greatest ship in the world and all that sort of thing was taken up by the Western Electric Company when they're planning their corporate picnic. And that brings us up to July 24th. Western Electric charters 4 cruise ships, including the Eastland. There'll be 10,000 people there scheduled to attend the picnic, which is going to be 38 miles away in Michigan City, Indiana. But before anyone steps foot on the boat, let's have a look at things that have been done to the Eastland, modifications that were done to the Eastland from 1903 through to 1915, each one lessening the stability of the ship. You wouldn't think that the sinking of the Titanic 3 years before would have any impact on this sinking, but it did. What happened because of the Titanic was in Congress there became a movement for lifeboats for all. Now, what they did is they after hearings, they passed legislation saying that every ship had to have lifeboats that could carry at least 75% of the passengers. I guess the other 25% were just supposed to swim. Now, Congress passes the bill. The Eastland was designed to carry 6 lifeboats. That was upgraded to 11, and then they had to add 37 life rafts. Each of those devices weighed about 1,100 pounds. That meant 45,000 additional pounds were being added to the top decks of the Eastland, making it even more unstable. And it was noted during the hearings in Congress that the Detroit and Cleveland Navigation Company stated, you don't understand, the ships on the Great Lakes have shallow bottoms. If you put that much weight on top, one of these things is going to roll over. They ignored the steamship company's recommendations, made them put the life rafts on anyways, and it may have caused or contributed to the accident we're about to talk about. The ship also replaced hardwood floors on the upper 2 decks, and that added with 2.5 inches of concrete, which added 25,000 pounds in weight to the upper portion of the ship, and that reduced. Well, the metrocentric height of a ship, that's a technical term. Metrocentric height is the amount of roll that the ship can have and still be expected to return back to level. So a ship should have, according to the documents here, between 2 and 4 feet of roll. Should be able to roll 2 to 4 feet and still come back. If it gets beyond that, 5, 6, 7 feet, you're running the risk then of just continuing the roll and capsizing. And there was evidence presented at the hearings after the incident that the metacentric height of the Eastland had been reduced to as little as 4 to 6 inches. What you're going to see is probably how the list started. That level is what the list started with in the disaster. But here we go. On the morning of the 25th, they begin loading the ship at 7 o'clock in the morning. They're loading them 50 people per minute. There are 2 government inspectors there keeping count. The Eastland is licensed to carry 2,500 passengers plus crew. At about 7:15, they notice there's listing. It begins listing to port. And port, as the way it's lined up, is away from the dock. So it begins listing away from the dock. Didn't seem to bother anybody on the ship. It wasn't a huge list, and then it came back. All right, but by 7:23, it began listing even more, and it began going further and further to port, and water began pouring in the lower portholes. And the water that's coming in here, the engine crew realizes this thing may go down, and they fly out of the boat and they're gone. By 7:28, 5 minutes later, that list has increased to 45 degrees. And at that point in time, grand pianos and refrigeration units are sliding down the interior decks, crushing people on the inside. And 2 minutes after that, it continues and just rolls over onto its back. It was strange. It was by chance whether people lived or died. If you were lucky enough to be in one location, you might have been able to just go through the window up onto the top of the ship and basically walk off the ship without even getting your feet wet. If you were 20 feet away, you might have been trapped below deck and drowned within minutes. It really depended on where you were. People on the top of the ship were, for the most part, just thrown into the Chicago River, where they bobbed around like corks. You have to remember there were 10,000 people there watching loading and now watching the event. And if they could swim, and remember, most people back then couldn't swim. That's one of the reasons such a tragedy. Most people couldn't swim. There were no swimming pools back then. The high schools didn't have swimming pools, even if you went to school. So if you were in the water, there was a good chance you were going to drown. And people that were swept in there, well, the people who could swim to a great extent, jumped in from shore, tried to save who they could. Some ended up going down with them. Other people were throwing in wooden crates and such to give them something to hold on to. They were as likely to kill somebody in the water as they were to help somebody else. People tried, but there wasn't a lot they could do. The screaming was incessant. People were struggling. It was noted the women were a little bit more resolute in their convictions. They took their fate quietly. The men were panicking and splashing about. After about half an hour, it's all over. The screaming has subsided, and if you've survived, you've survived, and if you haven't, you haven't. And then it becomes a rescue cleanup operation. There was a woman, though, that we should take notice of. It's Helen Ripa, a Western Electric nurse. She worked for the company. She was there in a nurse's outfit. That gave her some level of authority. She took on the job of triage for the ship. She was there on top of the ship as people were being pulled through the portholes, some of them bleeding profusely. She was making decisions who's going to the hospital versus who can be treated here and go home. She had someone contact the Marshall Field Department Store and get 500 blankets sent over to the hospital. They also made arrangements for food and drink to be sent to the hospital. And when a person was not injured, she made arrangements for these people to go home. And how did they do it? Well, she said, as survivors made it to the dock, she decided to send the less injured home. I would simply go out on the street, stop the first automobile that came along, load it up with people, and tell the owner or driver where to take them, she later wrote. And not one driver said no. So everyone was pitching in and helping on that day. But it was terrible. It was commented on that people were struggling in the water, clustered so thickly that they covered the surface of the river. The screaming was the most horrible of all. Well, you're only a few blocks from the Chicago Tribune offices here, so obviously they're on the scene quickly. Here we have the Chicago Tribune, Sunday, July 25th, 1915, page 3. It says, amazing photograph of Eastland disaster. The photograph showing the victims in the water was taken about 8 minutes after the catastrophe. It says here, women calmly await death or rescue while men battle in panic. We have some nice photographs here of the ship laying on its side like a giant wounded tuna, just laying there. It's hard to believe that 800 people could have died in this, but they did. Early reports of the disaster slightly exaggerated the number of dead. Chicago Tribune, July 25th, page 1. 919 bodies recovered. Total Eastland victims may reach 1,200. That's obviously more than there were. Boat overturning blamed on mistake. Officers accused. Error or oversight explains listing and tipping of Eastland at Clark Street docks. Then about 20 years later, a really nice photograph is printed in the Indianapolis Star. Eastland disaster, in which 812 persons lost their lives, occurred 20 years ago Wednesday. And they have a picture of the boat with hundreds of people on top of the boat. Were lucky enough to be able to make it to the boat. And these ones basically could step off into rowboats and go to shore without any consequences. While those just feet below their feet were dead in the bows of the ship. The only way to get the bodies out was using divers, and they didn't have scuba divers back then. You had those deep sea kind of divers with diving bell helmets on. And we have a nice photograph here of 7 of the divers who went repeatedly down into the ship and removed eventually within a few days all of the corpses. Now the Chicago Tribune began listing the names of the dead and photographs of them. There's an article here, Chicago Tribune, page 2 of July 25th, photos of 25 of the victims. Some of the dead and missing in tragedies, the headline. And what I want you to look at are the names here, such as Hoffman, Slavinsky, Manikovsky, Chekabovsky, and Schultz. They don't roll off the tongue like Vanderbilts and Astors, but that doesn't make them any less important. And this tragedy remains well known on only one place in Chicago. To deal with the huge amount of dead and the identification of same, temporary morgues were set up throughout the downtown area. And over the next couple of days, the bodies will be identified. The names of the missing were listed in the Tribune on page 4. Names of the missing in the Eastland passenger list, and they have them done there by alphabetically. And one of those people, perhaps the most famous of all of the victims, is Little Willie Novotny. Now, no one knew who Little Willie was for the first 3 days following the tragedy. He remained unidentified. He was known as Little Feller by the police and morgue personnel, and is number 396 down at the morgue. Finally, his grandmother was able to identify him by the clothes he was wearing, and a couple of his schoolmates also came in for a positive identification. But by that time, 3 days after the disaster, he was basically a well-known celebrity in Chicago. And in his funeral is covered here in the Chicago Tribune, August 1, 1915. Willie never knew he was so important, but much of Chicago attends his funeral, number 396, the biggest of the Eastland services. It's gigantic. It's like the Pope died, but that's tragedy and the loss of young life. Doesn't mean that all the stories were bad. We've got a tale here of redemption here. Chicago Tribune, July 25, 1915. The headline is, "Who has little Martha? 3-year-old handed to stranger through window by parents who escaped. Missing Martha Benka, age 3. Please return to Mr. and Mrs. Julius Benka, 3816 South Leonard Avenue." And so she was. In the Tribune of July 26, little Martha back home. 3-year-old Martha Benka was returned to the residence of her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Julius Benka. The person who had pulled her through the window, turns out he was a policeman. And when he saw the article in the Tribune, he made arrangements and returned little Martha. The ship didn't stay at the bottom of the river for long. It didn't have any big holes in it or anything. It just turned over. All they had to do was plug up the windows and doors and pump the water out. The ship was raised. We have a photograph of that was contained in the Chicago Tribune of July 19th, 2015, on the 100th anniversary of the tragedy. The city was in mourning. The city wanted to help. That's where charitable donations come in. On the day of the disaster, Western Electric Company, which was in no way responsible for the tragedy, pledged $100,000 or $3 million towards relief. The city, through the American Red Cross, raised another $200,000. So they had $300,000, the equivalent of $9 million for victim relief. They conducted a series of interviews. The Red Cross conducted a series of interviews, and they initially dispersed $110,000, which is like $3 million, to 69 families. And then on September 18th, 2 months after the tragedy, they made final payments to 540 families, totaling $170,000, which is $5 million today. So they raised $9 million, and that was given to the victims. But come on, there's got to be more to that. Isn't there anybody like Top Dog or something like that can come in here and sue these sons of guns and get the people what they deserve? Well, we'll see. First thing they did was there was a grand jury was called, and evidence was called. Chicago Tribune, Chicago, Sunday, July 25th, 1915. And this is an amazing coincidence, this article, amazing coincidence. Titanic seaman blames empty ballast tanks. Ocean survivor now in Eastland tells of sinking a boat. This fellow was working on the Titanic when it went down, and almost all the crew died, but somehow he survives. And then he's working the Eastland when it goes down. It says, here's what he did. Put on bathing suit. He goes, my locker was on the starboard side, the side that was up, and I got down and put on my bathing suit. I crawled back through the passageway leading back to the saloon without any trouble. I didn't meet anyone there, but there must have been 100 persons in the lounge. They were hanging on the moldings to chairs to life preservers, and I guess there were several who were drowned in the water, which filled the under half of the cabin. I told them I could get them out if only they would hang on to the life preserver long enough. There were 6 in the first party that I led forward. So he's in there pitching away, saving lives, and he's a survivor of the Titanic, and he says that it was empty ballast tanks. And there's a wonderful cutaway shot here of how the Eastland would have looked along with with the ballast tanks and the pipes that service them. Now, it says here, and this is what the Titanic gentleman was talking about. He goes, steam shipment stated yesterday that an imaginary line known as the stability line, and that's the same as the other line we were talking about, which keeps the steamer upright, was only 4 inches deep on the Eastland. These same men said the government requires this to be 20 inches, and that most ships of the Eastland size would have that at 32 inches. On the big ships that travel the Great Lake, that go over across all of Lake Huron, that they would have 40 inches. So it was incredibly deficient, so that a roll of 6 inches or so, 10 inches, could have caused the capsizing of the ship, which in fact is what happened. Now, a grand jury, as they said, a grand jury was indicted. It indicted the president and 3 officers of the steamship company for manslaughter, and the ship's captain and engineer for criminal carelessness. And they found the disaster was caused by conditions of instability caused by overloading of passengers, mishandling of water ballast, and the ship's faulty construction, all of which were true. But that's only the grand jury's finding. You got to get a real jury to convict and a real judge on board. And here's what happens. The evidence that came into the grand jury included the Chicago Tribune, August 1, 1915, Eastland coal out of balance, U.S. jurors told, fuel passers testify 80 tons were stored on the port side against 25 in the other. So maybe the coal was out of balance too. Jury foreman sifts evidence as the ballast tanks badly worked, so the ballast tanks weren't working properly. So that's what, that's That was a finding of the grand jury. People are suspicious, though, that the fix is going to get put in. Because why? Because when rich guys are being sued by poor guys, the fix is often put in. And so here we have the Chicago Tribune of August 1, 1915. Chicago Poles appealed to President Wilson to block any whitewashing inquiry. A group of Polish societies in Chicago last night dispatched to President Wilson an appeal for a complete investigation of the Eastland disaster. They want to make sure that it's all in the up and up. But it wasn't. Come on. Here we got a thing here. Chicago Tribune, February 6, 1916. Eastland case decree delayed. Judge studies facts. Well, they studied the facts enough, they threw out the case. What the judge found was that the ships that ship had run for years and years and years without a major accident. It was therefore, because it had run for years and years and years, it was inherently safe, and that the owner and the captain were entitled to rely on that safeness to not to their detriment, and that there was no reason to suspect problems, even though I just documented about 20 pages of reasons why you might have suspected problems. But the finding was there were no problems. Threw the case out, no money against the ship owners. Okay, well that's the criminal charges. What about civil litigation? Here we have the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, March 16, 1919. Eastland litigation continues. Relatives of victims of the Eastland disaster at Chicago renewed their efforts today to obtain damages of the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company. That case got thrown out and lost. They got nothing against the company. So the company men didn't go to jail. They didn't have to pay any money. So they started saying, is there anyone else we can sue? How about suing the city of Chicago because they ran the docks and they should have had higher standards for whatever kind of boats they were going to let into the Chicago docks? Well, they did. They sued them and found here on the Niles Daily Star, April 20th, 1924, Chicago is not liable in suit. Echo of Great Eastland disaster heard in court. It says as a result of the verdict of not guilty and no damages, dismissal of the other suits asking for a total of $10 million from the city is expected. Everything's tossed out. Nobody gets no money. Unless you got money in the original distribution of the charity funds, you got nothing for the death of your family. Well, that's almost the end of the SS Eastland. I told you before they raised it. Well, they raised the silly boat and they sold it to the U.S. government, where it was renamed the Wilmette, and it became a gunship, and it was used as a training boat on the Great Lakes until 1945, to the end of the war, when it was scrapped at that time. I don't know how you would have got on the Wilmette knowing that it was the Eastland. It just seems too creepy, but I guess the Navy isn't frightened by creeps. Well, after that tragic tale, I could really use a drink. And know how we do themed cocktails here at the 100 Years and More show? Well, in honor of the fact that almost all of the victims are Central and Eastern Europeans, we're going to do something stranger here. We're going to use the Polish plum brandy. That's plum nalewka. We're going to do a plum nalewka tonic instead of a gin and tonic. It'll work just as well. Take an ounce and a half of plum nalewka, put it in the glass, fill the glass with ice, then fill the remainder with tonic. Stir it 3 times. Garnish with a wedge of nice sweet plum. You can use a straw and drink this. Drink this even with a straw. And salute the victims of the SS Eastland. Now, remember to like and subscribe. You made it this far. We really want to develop the channel. And we'll see you next week with another entertaining, interesting 100 Years and More show. Take care, everybody.